Korean War. In 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. But this was no ordinary war. It changed the world. North versus South, but soon the US, China, and the USSR were drawn in. How did it all begin? Korean War. Records from the outbreak to the ceasefire. The beginning of war. Background of the outbreak of war. The development and consequences of the war. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War broke out due to North Korea's illegal invasion of South Korea, and it was stalled due to UN intervention and Chinese participation in the war, and then it was suspended by the 1953 Armistice Agreement. This war entrenched the division of North and South Korea. After World War II, Korean independence was guaranteed in the Cairo and Potsdam declarations, but after the surrender of Japan in 1945, it was divided and occupied by the US and the US along the 38th parallel. After the Moscow Tripartite Conference decided to rule the trust for 5 years, an anti-trust movement took place, and a joint US-Soviet committee was held, but it broke down without a solution. In 1947, the United States raised the Korean issue to the United Nations, and the United Nations decided to hold a general election between the two Koreas, but due to the Soviet refusal, elections were held only in South Korea, and the Korean government was established. North Korea also declared the Democratic People's Republic of Korea centered on Kim Il-sung, and the Korean Peninsula was divided. North Korea demanded the withdrawal of both US and US forces, and the Soviet Union initiated the withdrawal of troops. South Korea requested the presence of US troops, but the US withdrew, leaving only a military advisory group. The 38th parallel became the border, and North Korea strengthened its military power with the support of the Soviet Union. After the signing of the Sculpture Military Secret Agreement, the Korean troops belonging to the Chinese Communist Army were delivered to North Korea. Kim Il-sung envisioned armed unification thanks to strengthening military power and changing domestic and foreign situations. Overseas, there were Chinese communism, withdrawal of USFK, announcement of the Acheson Line, and Stalin's approval of the invasion of South Korea, and domestically, the collapse of the South Korean Labor Party, intensifying competition with Park Hee-young, confusion in South Korea, and inferiority of the ROK military played a role. North Korea launched a peaceful offensive, concealing its plan for armed unification. South Korea established the armed forces, but the equipment was poor, and the deployment of troops was also concentrated on the guerrilla sweep. On June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a full invasion of the South, and the United States convened the UN Security Council to condemn North Korea's aggression. The United Nations requested North Korea to withdraw its 38th parallel and requested South Korean assistance from member states, but North Korea ignored it. President Truman ordered the support of South Korean troops, and the Security Council adopted a recommendation for South Korean assistance to defeat North Korea, approving U.S. military measures. After the frontline inspection, MacArthur requested the U.S. Department of Defense to send ground forces, and the Security Council delegated the supreme command of UN military activities to the United States, appointing MacArthur as the commander-in-chief of the UN forces. With the decision to dispatch UN forces, military command was given to MacArthur, and the 16-nation army was placed under his command. President Syngman Rhee wrote a memorandum of war that transferred the command of the South Korean military's operations to MacArthur. North Korea launched a surprise attack under the pretext of liberation of South Korea, occupied Seoul, and continued its southward advance. The 24th Infantry Division of the United States moved to Korea, but it was not enough, and the UN forces established the Nakdonggong River Defense Line. North Korea organized the People's Committee, implemented a mobilization policy to carry out the war, and forcibly conscripted young people and boys into volunteer forces, carrying out a reign of terror in occupied territories. During the Korean War negotiations, the issue of refusal to repatriate due to anti-communist prisoners of war occurred, and negotiations were difficult. MacArthur planned an Incheon landing operation, but faced opposition from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. However, MacArthur insisted on Incheon's topographical weaknesses, the North Korean military's neglect of defense, and the psychological effect of recapturing Seoul, and eventually carried out the Incheon landing operation with the permission of the president. The U.S. military and the South Korean Marine Corps made a surprise landing in Incheon on September 15, captured Incheon, and moved east to recapture Seoul. The 7th U.S. Division joined the UN forces moving south and north, cutting off the North Korean forces into the north and south. UN forces entered Seoul on September 26, held a ceremony to commemorate the restoration of Seoul on September 29, and moved north to the 38th parallel. The success of the Incheon landing operation reversed the situation, and the restoration of Seoul provided the Korean government with an opportunity for unification, but there was a controversy over the purpose of the UN forces' participation in the war. During the Korean War in 1950, the purpose of the UN forces' participation in the war was to restore peace on the Korean Peninsula, but President Syngman Rhee and Commander MacArthur made unification the goal of the war. President Truman also viewed Korea's right to unification positively, and the U.S. government authorized military operations north of the 38th parallel if there was no risk of involvement between the Soviet Union and China. The Chinese military's plan to participate in the war was carried out while General MacArthur's recommendation to surrender was ignored, and Zhou Enlai expressed his deep interest in the Joseon issue to the United Nations and expressed his opposition to the UN forces breaking the 38th parallel. He warned that if the UN forces crossed the 38th parallel, the Chinese would be dispatched, but this was considered a threat. The South Korean military was already moving north across the 38th parallel, and there was a debate at the United Nations over the pros and cons of advancing north. The United Nations adopted a new resolution, reminding the original purpose of Korea's unification, independence, and establishment of a democratic government, confirming the actions of the United Nations forces and the importance of aid from member states. The resolution includes securing stability on the Korean Peninsula, holding elections organized by the United Nations through cooperation between the delegations of the two Koreas, allowing the UN forces to act across the Korean Peninsula if necessary, and establishing and operating the United Nations Commission for the Reconstruction of Korea UNCURK. With this resolution, the UN forces were allowed to advance north of the 38th parallel, and the northward movement began in earnest. UN forces were allowed to act only 240 kilometers from the Soviet and Chinese borders. MacArthur recommended surrender to North Korea and declared that military action should be taken in case of non-compliance. The Korean 1st Corps occupied Wonsan, and the U.S. 10th Corps landed and supported it. The 8th U.S. Army occupied Pyongyang, but MacArthur's insistence on separate operations caused confusion. MacArthur ordered the UN forces to advance northward without limit, which served as an opportunity for the Korean government to materialize its unification policy. President Syngman Rhee proposed 4 conditions for unification to the United Nations, but the UN Interim Committee on Korean Affairs made it clear that the North Korean region should not be under the control of the South Korean government. Until the general election, the United Nations placed the Korean Peninsula under the control of the UN commander and limited the authority of the Korean government to south of the 38th parallel. In response, the South Korean government protested and introduced 5 North Korean governors into North Korea and expressed its intention to establish a civil government in North Korea without interference from the United Nations. However, this violated UN policy, and the South Korean government withdrew its position, leaving the U.S. military government in charge of Pyongyang and Wonsan municipalities. After his visit to Pyongyang, President Syngman Rhee opposed the UN's resolution on the general elections between the two Koreas, insisting on an election unique to North Korea. This made it difficult for the UN forces to restore North Korea to be a direct trigger for South Korea's unification policy, and the war situation was reversed due to the intervention of the Chinese military, and hopes for unification began to fall through. In October 1950, Beijing Broadcasting declared the UN forces breaking the 38th parallel as illegal and warned that they would not stand by, considering it as a threat to China's safety. The United States felt anxious about the possibility of Chinese intervention, but judged that it was not realistic. At the Wake Conference, General MacArthur optimistically predicted that the resistance of the North Korean army would soon end and that there was no possibility of Chinese intervention. Contrary to MacArthur's optimistic outlook, the Chinese military intervened in the Korean War. The UN military operations were restricted due to concerns from the U.S. State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff banned MacArthur from bombing areas close to the Chinese border. The South Korean military advanced to the Yalu River border in Cheongjin, but the U.S. military struggled as it was surrounded by the Chinese army in Unsan. The UN forces retreated due to supply difficulties, but the South Korean forces continued to advance north and reached Haesan. General MacArthur pursued a northward policy, believing that air power could keep the Chinese forces in check. MacArthur prioritized the attack on the Yalu River, informed that the UN forces were engaged with the Chinese forces, and ordered the bombing of the Yalu River Bridge. The U.S. government ordered the suspension of the attack due to a lack of Allied consultations, but MacArthur strongly opposed it. Eventually, the ban on Air Force activities at the border was lifted. MacArthur was granted permission to bomb the southern part of the Yalu River Bridge and demanded pursuit of Chinese territory, but was rejected. The Chinese military participated in the Anti-American Aid Security Agency, under the slogan and took an oath to learn the sins of American imperialism and respect the Joseon government. The Allied forces resumed their advance, but contrary to MacArthur's declaration at the end of the war, the Joint Chiefs of Staff tried to entrust the advance on the Yalu River to the South Korean military only, but MacArthur objected. In November, when the Western Front collapsed due to a massive Chinese offensive, MacArthur officially recognized the Chinese military's involvement and declared a new war to the United Nations. The UN forces retreated repeatedly, and MacArthur's request for bombing Manchuria and the use of the National Wealth Forces was rejected. Eventually, Pyongyang was occupied by the Communist forces again. The U.S. 10th Corps stopped retreating near the Wonsan and Huignam lines and the U.S. 8th Army near the 38th parallel. Criticism of MacArthur increased, and the Huignam withdrawal operation was completed on December 24. The Chinese military intervention reversed the situation, and MacArthur insisted on a full response to the Chinese military, requesting a new strategy with reinforcements. President Truman was wary of the risk of an all-out war, refused to land in southern China, and showed interest in withdrawing the Korean Peninsula. The UK expressed concern about the remarks considering the use of atomic bombs, and the Truman-Attlee statement emphasized the peaceful achievement of UN objectives on the Korean Peninsula, suggesting a weakening of US policy toward Korea. Since then, the United States has supported the resolution to form a three-member committee to investigate the basic conditions of the Korean armistice submitted to the UN General Assembly. The UN Tripartite Commission's contact with China failed, and China continued to advance south, taking advantage of the favorable war situation. On January 4, 1951, the Communist Army reoccupied Seoul, and Truman declared a state of emergency, but it had no significant impact on the war situation. MacArthur insisted on a full response, but it was not accepted, and the Communist Army's advance south was stopped by an air attack by the UN forces. From January 1951, the UN forces resumed counterattacks, recapturing Incheon, Gimpo, and Seoul, and breaking the 38th parallel again. MacArthur had a conflict with the U.S. government seeking a ceasefire over the Manchurian bombing claims, and the UN defined China as an aggressor and voted to embargo military supplies. With the success of the UN forces operation, they re-break the 38th parallel and seized air superiority. The Truman administration considered a ceasefire in a wait-and-see stance, and MacArthur's strategy to pursue victory was at odds with Truman's negotiation strategy. The U.S. State Department drafted a diplomatic statement on the ceasefire and sought the consent of the dispatched country. The Truman administration considered a ceasefire in a wait-and-see stance, and MacArthur's strategy to pursue victory was at odds with Truman's negotiation strategy. The U.S. State Department drafted a diplomatic statement on the ceasefire and sought the consent of the dispatched country. President Truman dismissed General MacArthur and appointed Ridgway as his successor. This is an incident that reaffirmed the principle of civilian control over the military. The war intensified due to the Communist Spring Offensive, but the war situation stalled due to the goal of the limited war. Since then, discussions on the ceasefire have resumed at the suggestion of the Soviet Union. When the armistice was boosted by the limited war and the communist side suffered from damage and economic burdens, Malik proposed a discussion of the armistice. UN Commander Ridgway proposed a ceasefire meeting to Kim Il-sung and Feng Dehuai, and the communist side accepted it, and the ceasefire meeting was held in Kaesong. The talks went smoothly and agreed on the agenda, but they suffered from the issue of establishing the boundary between the two armies. While the United States insisted on making a decision according to the line of contact, the communist side insisted on restoring the 38th parallel to its original state, and the talks stalled, and the communist side issued a statement suspending the talks. When the talks stopped, the battle intensified. Armistice talks resumed at Panmunjom, but the issue of repatriation of prisoners of war was difficult. While the UN forces insisted on the free repatriation of prisoners of war, the communist forces insisted on forced repatriation and confronted each other. As a result, the prisoner of war subcommittee was suspended, and the conflict intensified due to the outbreak of an epidemic in North Korea. After the International Committee of the Red Cross refused to enter North Korea and the resumption of the Prisoner of War Exchange Committee, the communist side agreed not to punish prisoners of war, but after the UN notified the number of those wishing to return home, the communist side insisted on forced repatriation and broke down. Since then, the Gyeonggi Island prisoner unrest and the confinement of General Dot have occurred, making the armistice talks more difficult. General Clark was appointed as the commander of the UN forces to replace Eisenhower, and the battle intensified by taking hardline measures such as bombing the Supung Dam. Eisenhower was elected in the U.S. presidential election, and he promised to visit Korea to end the Korean War. After his election, Eisenhower visited Korea to reveal the prevention of war expansion and pressured the communist side to hold armistice talks. President Eisenhower's inauguration and Dulles appointment put pressure on the communist side. The United Nations formed a POW repatriation committee and decided to repatriate prisoners freely, but faced opposition from the Soviet Union and China. After Stalin's death, China made a new proposal to leave prisoners of war who did not want to be repatriated to neutral countries and resolve them. The exchange began with an exchange agreement for corporal artillery, and the resumption of the armistice talks agreed to form a neutral monitoring committee. The Korean government opposed the end of the war due to the state of division, and President Syngman Rhee refused to transfer anti-communist prisoners of war to the communist side. Syngman Rhee regarded the ceasefire as a suicide act and expressed his position that the South Korean military alone would be willing to wage war. Eisenhower notified that he would exclude South Korea from the command of the UN commander in the event of a ceasefire, and South Korea opposed the ceasefire due to protests in support of unification policy and refusal of Indian soldiers to enter the country. The United States persuaded the communist side through Clark, persuaded the Chinese through the Indian government, and urged Syngman Rhee to agree to a ceasefire through a letter from Eisenhower, but Syngman Rhee ordered the refusal of ceasefire negotiations by proposing the signing of the Korea-US Mutual Defense Treaty and the simultaneous withdrawal of foreign troops. The United States promised Syngman Rhee the ROK-US Defense Treaty and military and economic aid, but Syngman Rhee released 27,000 people as anti-communist prisoners of war after signing the prisoner of war repatriation agreement without the absence of the Korean representative. The communist side criticized the United States, and the United States explained that it had nothing to do with it and demanded that the ceasefire negotiations be maintained. The United States has been engaged in specific negotiations to persuade Syngman Rhee. The United States sent a special envoy, Robertson, to persuade President Syngman Rhee to ceasefire, but met with stubborn resistance. As the battle continued, Syngman Rhee eventually agreed to a ceasefire due to unfavorable war conditions. The United States proposed conditions such as signing the Korea-US Mutual Defense Treaty, long-term economic aid, withdrawal in the event of no results of the unification meeting, and support for the reinforcement of the ROK military, and the armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. After the armistice agreement, the United States approved the plan to expand economic aid to Korea, and the UN forces declared a joint response to the invasion of Korea. Dulles signed the Korea-US Mutual Defense Treaty and agreed to pursue peaceful unification and withdraw in the event of a breakdown in the talks. The UN General Assembly urged the holding of political talks, but the preliminary talks broke down due to the issue of participation in the Soviet Union. After the release of 3,000 people, a foreign affairs meeting was held in Geneva, but only the Indochina ceasefire was established and the issue of Korean unification could not be resolved. The Korean Peninsula issue continued to be divided by the declaration of the end of the discussion by the 16 UN dispatched countries, and the United States solidified its status as the world's most powerful country. The Korean War greatly increased the influence of the United States on international politics, which continued after the armistice. In addition, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union intensified, leading to the structured East-West Cold War. The People's Republic of China was defined as an invader by the United Nations for its participation in the Korean War, but its voice on Asian issues became internationally recognized. The Korean War turned the domestic atmosphere in the United States to the right and raised anti-communist hysteria. McCarthyism ousted liberals in the United States, strengthened anti-communist policies, created organizations like CEDAW, and intensified U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The Soviet Union also suppressed the people's desire to improve consumer life and promoted heavy industry policies by strengthening military power and strengthening alliances. The Korean War contributed to strengthening the Mao Zedong system in China, reviving Japan's economy, and stabilizing the conservative system. It has caused enormous human, material, and mental damage to the Korean people, and it is difficult to determine the size of the loss due to the lack of accurate statistics. The ROK Armed Forces suffered a total of 987,000 losses due to deaths, injuries, and disappearances, and civilian casualties totaled 1.4 million, including the loss of victims, deaths, injuries, abductees, missing persons, forced conscripts, and police officers, resulting in a total of 2.3 million human losses. In the case of North Korea, the North Korean military has 520,000 deaths, 406,000 injuries, and 2 million civilian losses. The Korean War resulted in the loss of about 3.29 million lives in North Korea, 150,000 in the UN forces, and 900,000 in the Chinese forces, and about 5.2 million South Koreans were killed in the two Koreas. In particular, the loss of non-combatants was significant. The Korean War caused enormous human and material losses. Numerous deaths and 10 million separated families occurred, and social and economic infrastructure such as schools, factories, and roads were destroyed. In particular, North Korea's mining, industrial, and agricultural productivity decreased significantly, and farmland was also damaged. The Korean War caused enormous human and material damage, destroying private houses, schools, and hospitals, causing a series of displaced people, and decreasing agricultural and gross national product. In addition, distrust and hostility within the nation intensified, undermining the atmosphere of unification and widespread black and white logical thinking. The Korean War caused great damage to North Korea and served as an opportunity to strengthen the Kim Il-sung regime. Just before the war, several factions coexisted in the power structure of North Korea, but Kim Il-sung consolidated his power by purging the coastal military leader Mojang. The Korean War deepened the anti-Americanism of North Koreans, and Kim Il-sung used it to justify his dictatorship. The Korean War destroyed the North Korean economy. Due to insufficient support from the Soviet Union, it was promoted by mobilizing residents' efforts, and the mobilization system was strengthened through the Cholima movement. The Korean War also affected North Korea's foreign relations. During the Korean War, the Soviet Union did not support North Korea much, so Kim Il-sung became distrustful of the Soviet Union. The Chinese military actively supported the Soviet Union, and during the crisis of the collapse of the North Korean regime, the Chinese military rescued the Chinese military, and North Korea strengthened its friendship with the Chinese military, resulting in changes in foreign relations. After that, North Korea signed the DPRK-China Friendship Mutual Winzhou Treaty with China in July 1961 and became an alliance. The Korean War had a great influence on Korean society as a whole, and first of all, it strengthened the anti-communist state order. Immediately after liberation, the right wing took the center stage in South Korea's left-right struggle and prepared to establish a single government in South Korea, but left-right cooperation and inter-Korean negotiations were thwarted. The Korean War instilled in the Korean people the belief that the United States is a savior, and made them consider the alliance with the United States to be an essential element of ensuring national security. With this recognition, pro-American diplomacy has been strengthened since the armistice, and the Republic of Korea has thoroughly followed the foreign policy of the United States. Anti-communism sometimes surpassed that of the United States. The Korean War strengthened pro-American diplomacy and increased faith in the United Nations, but prevented diplomatic access to the Third World. In addition, industrial facilities, housing, and infrastructure were destroyed due to enormous damage to the Korean economy. The Syngman Rhee administration restored the post-war economy through U.S. economic aid and UN aid, and U.S. aid was a key element of the Korean economy in the 1950s. After the Korean War, the military grew significantly quantitatively and qualitatively, achieving unbalanced growth with various social forces, expanding its influence on domestic politics. With the support of the United States, military power expanded, and the signing of the Korea-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty systematized U.S. support, but the Daejeon Agreement transferred the command of the ROK military's operations to the U.S. military, strengthening U.S. control. The Korean War wasn't just a local conflict. It became the first hot war of the Cold War. Next time, we'll uncover how this war shaped the U.S. ROK alliance and changed Asia forever.